The hollow radio follows Tom Harper, a grieving man who begins hearing his late wife's voice whispering through the static of an old radio. At first it feels like hope, but the messages grow darker, warning of something coming. Drawn deeper into forbidden frequencies, Tom uncovers the town's hidden tragedies and a sinister force feeding on sorrow. The more he listens, the stronger the presence becomes, twisting his grief into terror. Is Claire truly calling from beyond, or is it a trap? A chilling tale of loss, obsession, and the deadly cost of listening too closely. The night had settled over the town like a thick, suffocating blanket. In his small, cluttered living room, Tom Harper sat hunched over an old, battered radio, the only source of light a dim amber glow from its dials. The air was heavy and still, save for the low hum of the device that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Outside, the world was swallowed by darkness and fog, the street lamps casting trembling shadows that merged with the creeping silence. Tom's fingers trembled as they moved over the radio's controls, adjusting the frequency in a desperate attempt to find anything that might break through the endless static. Weeks had passed since Claire's death, and the emptiness she left behind weighed on Tom like a relentless tide. The house felt hollow, every corner whispering memories that stabbed at his heart. He had become a ghost himself, wandering through the rooms, talking to shadows, searching for a connection that no longer existed. His nights were restless, haunted by dreams where Claire's voice was just out of reach, a fragile thread he couldn't grasp. Tonight, as the static crackled and hissed, something different stirred. Amid the white noise, a faint voice emerged, soft, trembling, and achingly familiar. Tom's breath caught in his throat. He leaned closer, eyes straining in the dim light, heart hammering against his ribs. The voice was broken, fragmented by the interference, but the tenderness, the unmistakable cadence, pulled at something deep within him. "Tom, beware, it's coming." The words were barely audible, swallowed by bursts of static, but the meaning was clear. It was Claire. Tears pricked at the corners of Tom's eyes as a surge of hope and terror collided inside him. Was it really her, or some cruel trick of his grief-addled mind? The voice faded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind only the relentless crackle of the radio. Unable to tear himself away, Tom adjusted the dial again, chasing the elusive sound. The voices tangled together, whispers, laments, and warnings from other unseen presences, layered beneath the static like a chorus of lost souls. The weight of their sorrow pressed against his chest, each fragment a reminder of the fragile boundary between life and death. In the silence of the room, the radio's glow reflected in the window pane, casting Tom's pale, drawn face back at him like a specter. The room felt colder now, as if the very air had thickened with unseen presence. The voices seemed to reach out, threading through the static to touch the raw wound of his heart. As the night deepened, Tom sat motionless, caught between despair and a desperate hope. Claire's fragmented warning echoed in his mind, a chilling promise that something dark was coming, something that threatened to shatter the fragile veil between worlds. The radio, once a relic of his past life as a technician, had become a conduit to the unknown, drawing him into shadows that stretched far beyond the boundaries of the living. He knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and resolute, that his life had changed forever. The static whispers were no accident. They were a call, a summons to confront the grief and darkness that lurked beneath the surface of the townland within himself. Tom's fingers tightened around the radio's cold casing, the words of Claire's warning burning in his thoughts. He would listen, he would seek answers, and whatever came next, he would not turn away. The night outside stretched on, silent but for the crackling voices that haunted the airwaves, pulling Tom deeper into the mystery and into the heart of his own sorrow. And so, the first threads of a terrifying journey wove themselves in the dark, where grief met the unknown, and the static whispered secrets that threatened to unravel everything Tom held dear. But as the radio fell silent again, the question lingered, heavy and unresolved. Was it truly Claire's voice he had heard, or something far more sinister? The answer, Tom knew, was out there somewhere in the static between worlds. He would find it, or be consumed by the search. The static was a constant companion now, a low, unyielding hum that filled the corners of my small living room like a second heartbeat. It was always there, a murmur beneath the silence, a reminder of the voices that danced just beyond reach. Every evening after work, I sank into the worn armchair by the window. The radio perched precariously on the side table, its antenna stretched out like a fragile limb seeking connection. It was during one of these restless nights that I first heard it, clearly not just the indecipherable crackle or the fleeting fragments of speech, but Claire's voice, faint, fragmented by static, but unmistakably hers. The words were broken, a warning whispered through the haze, but they stirred something inside me that I hadn't felt since her passing, a desperate hope. I clung to those fleeting moments as if they were lifelines thrown across the vast gulf of loss. But with hope came an unbearable ache. Memories flooded in unbidden Claire's laughter echoing down our sunlit hallway. The soft brush of her hand against my cheek, the way her eyes sparkled when she was caught in a moment of joy. Those moments were sharp and cruel in their absence, cutting through the fog of grief with their vividness. I found myself reaching out to the empty air, talking into the silence as if she might answer. The obsession took hold swiftly. Each day, I fiddled with the radio dials, chasing the ghostly echoes that might carry her voice. My nights were restless, filled with the low drone of static and the half-heard warnings that sent shivers down my spine. The town itself seemed to hum with the same restless energy, whispers of loss and longing woven into the fabric of its streets. It was Margaret Lane who first brought a semblance of grounding to my unraveling world. The local librarian, sharp-eyed and calm, she listened with a mixture of skepticism and compassion when I confessed what I'd been hearing. At first, she dismissed my tales as grief-stricken fantasies, but the earnestness in my voice, the desperation that clung to every word, softened her resolve. Together, we began to sift through the town's history, poring over yellowed newspapers and brittle records that smelled of dust and forgotten time. The silence in the library was profound, broken only by the soft rustle of pages and the distant ticking of an old clock. Each discovery seemed to peel back another layer of the town's hidden wounds, tragedies buried beneath the surface. Unexplained disappearances, whispers of strange occurrences tied to the very phenomenon that now consumed me. Margaret's presence was a strange comfort, a tether to reality as my own mind threatened to slip into the void. She was patient, asking the right questions, challenging my assumptions without dismissing the truth I clung to. Her skepticism was a balm and a challenge. It forced me to confront the possibility that I was not alone in this other lives. Other stories were interwoven with mine in a tapestry of grief and fear. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows through the stained glass windows of the library, I shared with Margaret the fractured voices I'd heard, the warnings, the pleas, Claire's voice cutting through the static with an urgency that made my heart pound. Her eyes softened, a mixture of concern and dawning belief reflecting back at me. She reached out, placing a gentle hand on my arm, grounding me in a moment suspended between doubt and hope. The more we uncovered, the more I felt the weight of the town's collective sorrow pressing down like a storm cloud ready to burst. The radios weren't just picking up random interference, they were resonating with something far darker, something ancient awakened by the grief that hung heavy in the air. At times, the line between memory and reality blurred. I would catch myself staring into the empty room, hearing Claire's laughter ripple through the silence or feeling the brush of her hand on my skin. Those moments were both a balm and a torment, reminding me of what was lost and what might still be reached. As night settled over the town, the static on the radio grew louder, more insistent. I adjusted the dial again, hands trembling, straining to catch another glimpse of the past, another whisper of a voice that refused to be silenced. The room seemed to close in around me, filled with the ghosts of memories and the haunting promise of warnings yet to come. With Margaret by my side, I felt a fragile hope flicker amidst the darkness. But the shadows were lengthening, and the voices fractured, urgent, warned of a darkness approaching, one that would test the fragile boundaries of our world and my own resolve. The radios were not just a window to the past. They were a doorway to something far more sinister, and I was caught on the threshold, desperate to protect what little light remained. The night deepened, and with it, the whispers grew louder. I sat alone, the glow of the radio flickering like a beacon in the dark, waiting for the next message from beyond the veil. Whatever lay ahead, I knew I could not turn away. Claire's voice was my anchor, and through the static, I would listen no matter the cost. The echoes of loss were all around me, but so too was a fragile thread of hope. And in that precarious balance lay the story of a town haunted, a man broken and searching, and a warning that would not be ignored. The morning light filtered weakly through the heavy curtains of Tom's living room, casting long, pale shadows across a scattering of radio parts and tangled wires strewn across the table. The static that had become a constant companion in his life buzzed softly from the vintage radio perched precariously on the edge of the cluttered surface. The voices, always there, always fractured and elusive, had begun to take a shape that his heart recognized, a shape that once was Claire. But today, Tom knew he had to do more than listen in isolation. The voices were no longer just his haunted solace. They were a mystery that needed unraveling. If the radios truly carried whispers from beyond, if Claire's voice was a warning and not a trick of his grief, then understanding the mechanism was crucial. And for that, he needed someone who knew the world of waves and static better than he did. Eli Jacobs was the obvious choice. The local radio host, a wiry man with a perpetually skeptical gaze, had dismissed the broadcasts at first. To Eli, it was just interference, a quirk of aging equipment and atmospheric conditions. But Tom hoped that beneath that skepticism lay the knowledge he needed. The radio station was tucked away in a corner of town, a small brick building humming with the pulse of transmission equipment. The moment Tom stepped inside, the air thickened with the scent of solder, paper, and an undercurrent of ozone. Flickering dials and blinking lights surrounded him, casting sharp contrasts of light and shadow that made the place feel alive, almost breathing. Eli looked up from a bank of consoles, his baseball cap tilted slightly back, exposing a furrowed brow. "Tom Harper," he said, voice rough but warm. "I didn't expect you here so early." "I need your help," Tom said, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Something's wrong with the radios. Voices from the dead." Eli snorted softly, shaking his head. "You and your ghosts. It's all static, interference, that's all." Tom's eyes didn't waver. "Listen." He turned the dial, and the room filled with the familiar hiss of static. Then, beneath the crackling white noise, a faint, broken voice emerged, soft, trembling, but unmistakably Claire's. "Tom, it's coming." Eli's expression shifted, disbelief mingling with something like dread. For a long moment, he said nothing, just listened. The voice dissolved back into static. "Okay," Eli said finally. "That's something." Encouraged, Tom and Eli plunged into the technical details. Eli explained the intricacies of frequency modulation, signal interference, and the quirks of the town's aging radio towers. Together, they mapped patterns in the broadcasts, noting how the voices flickered in and out across various bands, as if slipping between frequencies like ghosts between worlds. Their late-night sessions became routine. The glow of dials and meters illuminated their determined faces as they chased fragments of Claire's voice through the chaotic radio waves. Eli's skepticism softened into cautious intrigue, his technical mind wrestling to explain the unexplainable. Meanwhile, Tom's neighbor Sarah Collins approached him one afternoon, clutching a battered radio receiver like a talisman. Her eyes were wide, shadowed with fear. "I hear them too," she whispered, voice trembling. "Voices at night, whispering. Sometimes they sound like warnings." Tom listened as Sarah recounted her experiences, how the voices came unbidden, how they echoed her own grief, how they seemed to seep into her dreams. Her story mirrored his own haunting, a shared thread of loss stretching through the town's quiet streets. Together, they formed an uneasy circle of the afflicted, bound by static and sorrow. The broadcasts were no longer Tom's isolated nightmare. They were a communal echo of something far larger and darker. As the days passed, the voices grew more insistent, more fragmented, Claire's warnings sharper, more urgent. Tom's obsession deepened, fueled by the growing evidence and the shared experiences of others. But with each new revelation, the boundary between reality and nightmare weakened, and the static whispered darker things in the spaces between words. Late one evening, as a storm rolled in and thunder rumbled like the growl of some ancient beast, Tom and Eli huddled over the consoles. The radio crackled violently, voices overlapping in a cacophony of grief and warning. Amid the chaos, Claire's voice pierced through, clear and commanding. "Prepare. It comes for us all." The room fell silent, save for the hum of the machines. Tom felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. The mystery was no longer distant or abstract, it was here, imminent and terrifyingly real. And in that silence, the static seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, waiting, watching. Tom knew this was only the beginning. The night deepened outside, but inside the radio station, the fragile line between the living and the dead grew thinner with every passing moment. The voices in the static were not mere echoes, they were warnings, calls to arms against an encroaching darkness that fed on grief and fear. Tom's journey had taken him beyond his personal sorrow into a realm where memory and reality tangled, where the radios served as conduits to a world unseen. And as he leaned closer to the dials, listening for another fragment of Claire's voice, he understood that to fight what was coming, he needed to confront not only the spectral transmissions, but the shadows within himself. The static whispered on, and Tom Harper was ready to listen. The library was quieter than usual that afternoon. The usual hum of whispered conversations and rustling pages replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to press against the walls like the weight of the secrets hidden within. Margaret Lane sat hunched over a battered wooden table in the archive room, the dim glow of a single desk lamp illuminating the yellowed pages of old newspapers and brittle diaries spread out before her. Her sharp eyes scanned the faded text with growing unease. Each article and entry told a story not unlike the one unfolding now, a stretch of years marked by mysterious disappearances, strange sounds on radios, and a pervasive atmosphere of fear. "Look at this," Margaret said, her voice low but steady as she tapped a newspaper clipping. Here, from 1947, there was a string of disappearances. All clustered around the same time, strange radio interference was reported across the town. People heard voices, faint and disjointed, much like what you described. Tom leaned in, his pale face framed by a tangled mop of hair, eyes wide yet haunted. The cluttered living room of his house seemed worlds away from the musty, paper-scented stillness of the library, but the connection was undeniable. "It's always been here," he murmured, hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the old radio perched on his workbench. Static hissed through the speakers, voices swirling just beyond comprehension. "I don't think this is just some coincidence," Tom said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something's been feeding off the grief here for decades." Margaret nodded, her expression grave, "And it's growing stronger." Back at his home later that evening, Tom sat alone, the radio's soft crackle filling the room. The voices were fragmented, overlapping like a chorus of distant echoes, some mournful, others urgent. His fingers traced the dials absently, the static dancing at the edge of his hearing. A sudden chill crawled up his spine, and the hairs on the back of his neck prickled as an unsettling sensation took hold, the feeling of being watched, not by any living thing, but by something lurking in the shadows beyond perception. Memories of Claire flickered through his mind, her warm smile, the softness of her touch, the sound of her laughter. But these recollections soon twisted, merging with the disjointed voices on the radio, until he could no longer tell where memory ended and spectral interference began. The hollow presence was there, whispering through the static, weaving doubt and fear into the fabric of his thoughts. Days passed in a blur of research and restless nights. Margaret and Tom spent hours poring over the dusty archives, piecing together fragments of the town's dark history. The diary entries revealed a cycle of sorrow and disappearance, each tragedy feeding the entity that haunted the broadcasts. The more they uncovered, the heavier the weight upon Tom's shoulders grew. His once analytical mind was beginning to fray, obsession gnawing at his resolve. "We need to find a way to break the cycle," Margaret said one afternoon, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "If this force has been feeding on grief for so long, maybe it can be starved or banished." Tom shook his head, the lines of worry etched deeper into his face. "It's not just feeding, it's becoming stronger. I can feel it pulling at me, at all of us." That night, the boundary between worlds seemed thinner than ever. The radio buzzed with heightened static, voices rising in a chaotic crescendo. Tom's memories and the spectral warnings collided, a storm of sound and emotion that threatened to overwhelm his senses. Yet through the turmoil, Claire's voice emerged clearer than before, fragile, urgent, a tether to the light amidst the growing darkness. "Beware what comes," she warned, her voice fractured but unmistakable. "It feeds on our pain. Don't let it in." Tom's fists clenched around the radio's edge, determination flaring despite the fear and confusion. The hollow presence was no longer a distant shadow, it was here, entwined with the very air he breathed. And to protect the living, he would have to face it, even if it meant losing himself in the process. As the static swelled once more, the room seemed to close in, and the night stretched on, heavy with the promise of revelations yet to come. The signals from beyond were no longer just whispers, they were a call to arms, and Tom was listening.